The main hall of the Evans estate in the town of Willow Creek was filled with bright lamps, loud music, and dozens of guests wearing their finest clothes. Rich landowners talked in small circles near the bar, while young couples spun around the center of the floor, their leather shoes clicking against the dark wood. Near a tall glass window, far away from the crowd, a young woman stood by herself. Lily Evans watched the dancers while she tried to hide her face from the people walking past. 2 years ago, a terrible carriage accident on the mountain road had left a thick scar across her right cheek. The mark did not take away her green eyes or her bright smile, but it changed the way the town looked at her. The same young men who used to wait outside her house now looked at the floor whenever she walked into a room. On this night, she had spent 3 hours sitting by the wall, and not a single person had asked her to join them on the floor. As the fifth song began to play, Lily took a slow breath and pressed her cold hands against her blue dress. She decided to leave the party quietly before anyone saw the tears in her eyes. The humiliation was too much to bear, and she did not want to endure another minute of their pitying glances. She looked around the bright room one last time, seeing her old friends laughing and sharing stories as if she did not even exist. She turned away from the window and began to walk toward the back exit of the hall, hoping to slip into the dark garden without notice. Her boots made no sound on the thick rugs as she moved along the edge of the ballroom, keeping her head down to avoid any direct eye contact. Just as she reached the edge of the floor, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall swung open. A man walked inside, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. It was Nicholas, the night groundskeeper, who usually spent his hours alone in the dark woods surrounding the property. He had pure white hair that fell neatly around his face, and his skin was as pale as winter snow. He wore a simple dark coat that showed signs of long wear, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that drew every eye in the room. He stood near the entrance for a few seconds, looking across the crowded space, until his eyes found Lily standing near the exit. The lively chatter in the hall slowly died down as Nicholas walked onto the polished floor. Guests stopped drinking their wine and frowned, wondering why a low-wage worker was stepping into a formal event. He did not look at the angry faces or the guards who were moving toward him from the corners of the room. His steady steps brought him directly across the large hall, cutting through the crowd until he stood right in front of Lily. The silence grew deeper as people turned around to watch him, their whispers filling the air like dry leaves in the wind. Lily froze in place, her hand resting on the brass door handle as she watched the pale man approach her. Nicholas stopped and took off his dark wool cap, revealing his bright, clear eyes. He extended a long, pale hand toward her, his palm showing the rough marks of hard work, but his fingers remaining perfectly steady. He did not look at the thick scar on her cheek, nor did he look away to hide his discomfort. He looked straight into her eyes, seeing only her, and spoke in a clear, calm voice that everyone nearby could hear. He asked her if she would give him the honor of this dance, ignoring the glares of the wealthy men standing just a few feet away. His voice had a quiet strength that seemed to cut through the tension in the room. A heavy silence took over the entire ballroom, so deep that even the musicians up on the stage stopped playing their instruments. Lily looked up at him slowly, her heart drumming wildly against her ribs as she stared at his pale hand. For the first time in 2 years, someone was truly looking at her without fear or disgust in their eyes. She did not see the judgment of the town or the fake smiles of her old friends. She saw only a man who stood by her when everyone else chose to ignore her. She felt a sudden wave of courage wash over her, replacing the shame that had weighed her down all evening. At the far end of the hall, her father, Arthur Evans, rose from his leather chair with a dark scowl on his face. He began to walk toward them, his boots echoing loudly against the floor as he prepared to throw the worker out into the night. The guests held their breath, waiting for a scene or a shout that would end the strange moment. But before her father could reach them, Lily made her choice. She knew that stepping onto the floor with a groundskeeper would cause a scandal, but she did not care about the rules of the town anymore. Lily placed her small hand into his cold palm and gave him a gentle nod. The touch sent a strange warmth through her fingers, despite how cold his skin felt against hers. The musicians took a cue from her movement and began to play a slow, soft melody once again. Nicholas led her to the center of the floor, his movements smooth and practiced, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. They moved together with a grace that surprised everyone who watched, turning slowly under the bright lights of the chandeliers while the rest of the world seemed to disappear. They moved together across the floor while dozens of eyes watched them in complete shock. Lily forgot about the scar on her face and the whispers of the crowd as Nicholas guided her through the steps. He looked down at her with a calm expression, his presence providing a shield against the glares of her father and the neighbors. When the music finally ended, he bowed quietly, turned around, and walked back out into the dark night. He left the room in complete silence, leaving the wealthy guests staring at the empty doorway in disbelief, while Lily stood alone on the floor, her heart full of a strange new hope. The next morning the sun rose over the valley, but the mood inside the Evans house remained dark. Arthur Evans sat behind his heavy oak desk, his face tight with anger as he stared at the morning papers. He could not forget the embarrassment of the previous evening when his daughter danced with a nameless night worker in front of the most important families in the county. He picked up his brass bell and rang it loudly, demanding that his assistants bring the white-haired man to his office immediately. He tapped his fingers against the wood, counting the seconds until the door opened. Nicholas walked into the office a few minutes later, his white hair catching the morning light that streamed through the windows. He stood in front of the large desk with his hands behind his back, his pale face showing no fear at all. Arthur looked up at him, his eyes narrow and his voice sharp as he spoke. He told Nicholas that he had forgotten his place the night before and had insulted the family name by crossing the ballroom floor without permission. He demanded to know what a simple servant was thinking when he approached the daughter of the estate. Nicholas looked directly at the older man, his voice remaining calm and steady as he gave his answer. He said that he did not mean to insult anyone, but he could not sit by and watch a young woman be humiliated by a room full of people. He explained that kindness should not be limited by a person's job or status in the town. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and Arthur's face turned a deep red. It was rare for anyone to speak to him with such honesty, especially a simple worker who lived in the shadows. Arthur slammed his hand down on the wooden desk and stood up, pointing a finger at the door. He told Nicholas that men who worked in the dark did not belong in his ballroom or near his daughter. As a punishment for his actions, Arthur ordered that Nicholas be moved from his night duties to the hardest daytime labor on the estate. He was to carry heavy stone blocks and wood near the southern fields under the hot sun for the next 3 weeks. He warned him that any further trouble would result in him being thrown out of the valley completely. The daytime work was a brutal punishment for Nicholas, though nobody in the town knew the real reason why. His pale skin began to burn under the bright rays, and the heat made his head ache with a dull pain. He was a creature of the night, a vampire king who had lost his home and his memories years ago, and the sun was his greatest weakness. Yet he did not complain or ask for a break, lifting the heavy stones with an unnatural strength that surprised the other workers. He focused his mind on his tasks, refusing to let his physical pain show on his face. From her bedroom window up in the main house, Lily watched him work in the far fields. She saw his white hair gleaming under the sun, and noticed how he staggered slightly under the weight of the timber. She knew he was being punished because of her, because he had shown her kindness when no one else would. A deep feeling of guilt settled in her chest, and she knew she could not just sit in her room while he suffered. She watched him for an hour, noting how the other men avoided him as if he carried a disease. The other laborers kept their distance from Nicholas, whispering among themselves about his strange appearance and his odd habits. They noticed that he never ate his lunch during the day and only drank water when the sun went behind a cloud. They saw that his skin blistered quickly in the heat, but the wounds seemed to heal by the next morning. He was a mystery to them, an outsider who worked harder than 5 men combined, but never said a word. They watched him carry loads that required 2 horses, wondering what kind of man he really was. Lily spent the afternoon preparing a small bag with a flask of cold water and some soothing cream she had, made from herbs. She waited until her father left the house to visit a neighboring town on business before she slipped out the back door. She walked along the dirt path that led to the southern fields, her heart nervous but her mind completely made up. She needed to thank him, and she needed to make things right, no matter what her father might say when he returned. The heat of the afternoon was thick when Lily finally reached the edge of the southern field. She found Nicholas sitting in the thin shade of a large oak tree, his back resting against the rough bark. His pale skin was red from the sun, and his dark shirt was torn at the shoulder from carrying the heavy timber. He looked up when her boots crunched on the dry grass, his clear eyes showing a flash of surprise as she approached his resting spot. He started to stand up, but she waved her hand to tell him to remain seated. Lily walked closer and knelt beside him, opening her bag to pull out the flask of cold water. She extended it toward him, her hands steady despite the nervousness she felt inside. She told him that he looked tired and needed to drink before the heat caused him to collapse under the weight of the stones. Nicholas reached out and took the flask, his cold fingers brushing against hers for a brief second. He drank the water slowly, nodding his head in thanks as the cool liquid brought him some relief from the sun. After he finished drinking, Nicholas handed the flask back to her and told her that she should not be out here. He said that her father would be furious if he found out she was talking to a worker in the fields during the middle of the day. Lily shook her head and replied that she did not care about her father's anger on this day. She said that Nicholas should not be punished for being the only polite person at the ball, and she felt responsible for his current situation. A small, rare smile appeared on his pale face, softening his features and making him look younger. He told her that the work was not as bad as it looked, and that he had endured much worse things in his life before he arrived at this estate. Lily looked at his red skin and pulled out the small jar of herbal cream she had brought with her. She offered it to him, telling him it would help heal the burns from the hot sun and protect his skin for the remaining days of his punishment. Nicholas accepted the jar and began to rub the cream onto his arms, his movements slow and careful. As they sat together under the shade, the silence between them became comfortable, a quiet break from the harsh world outside. Lily looked down at her hands and confessed that she often felt like a different person since the accident 2 years ago. She said the girl she used to be died on that mountain road, leaving only a stranger behind. Nicholas listened to her words without interrupting, his quiet attention giving her the courage to speak openly about her feelings. He remained silent for a long moment before he gave his own reply, looking out over the dry fields. He said that they might be more alike than she thought, because he did not know who he was either. He explained that he had no memory of his family or his childhood, and that his life only began when he woke up in this valley years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back. The confession surprised Lily, and she looked at him with a new understanding in her eyes. She realized that while she had lost her position in town, Nicholas had lost his entire identity. He carried no family name, no history, and no memories of the people who had brought him into the world. He was completely alone, a drifter who worked in the shadows without knowing his own past. Yet he still possessed the kindness to help someone else in need. An old woman named Maeve was walking past the edge of the field, carrying a basket of dry wood for her stove. She stopped when she saw the young woman from the main house sitting next to the white-haired worker under the tree. Maeve had lived in the valley for over 40 years, and she noticed details that other people missed in their daily routines. She stayed behind a row of tall bushes, watching the two of them talk with an intensity that caught her attention. As Nicholas reached up to adjust his collar against the heat, his shirt moved aside, and a silver medallion slipped out, hanging from a thin cord around his neck. The metal caught a stray ray of sunlight, flashing brightly through the leaves of the tree. Maeve froze when she saw the shape of the medallion, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized that silver mark instantly, and the basket of wood almost slipped from her old hands as she stared at the glowing object. Maeve walked back to her small wooden cabin at the edge of the woods, her legs trembling with every step she took on the dirt road. The image of the silver medallion remained bright in her mind, shaking her to her very core with old memories. She locked her front door and walked into her dark bedroom, where the air smelled of dried lavender and old paper. She knelt down by the side of her bed and reached underneath, pulling out a heavy wooden chest that had been hidden there for decades. The old chest was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, untouched for over 20 years, since the great changes in the valley. Maeve blew the dust away and turned the old key in the lock, her hands shaking with excitement and fear. She lifted the heavy lid and began to pull out yellowed papers, old land maps, and bundles of letters tied together with faded string. These were the remnants of a past that the rest of the town had forgotten or chosen to ignore. She searched through the documents until she found a thick piece of paper with an official wax seal at the bottom. It was a record from the Northern Valley, detailing the family of King Vincent, the leader of the Night Dwellers who once ruled the mountain lands. 20 years ago, Vincent had died under mysterious circumstances, and his young son had vanished into the night without a trace. A wealthy man named Thomas Kingston had taken over the lands immediately after, claiming there was no legal heir left. Maeve unfolded a small drawing attached to the record, which showed a silver medallion shaped like a crescent moon with a star in the center. It was the exact same piece of silver she had just seen around Nicholas's neck in the field under the oak tree. Below the drawing, an old note stated that the true heir of the Night Dwellers carried a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear since the day he was born, a sign that could never be erased. Tears filled Maeve's eyes as she read the words, realization washing over her like a wave of cold water from the mountain river. She had known Nicholas since he arrived in the town as a quiet, pale boy who could not remember his name or where he came from. She remembered seeing that exact mark behind his ear when she helped wash his clothes. Years ago, after a hard day of work, she closed her eyes, knowing she held a secret that could destroy the most powerful man in the valley. Meanwhile, the sun began to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and dark red. Nicholas finished his work for the day and walked back toward the stables to store his tools for the night. He found Lily waiting for him near the old stone fence, away from the main path where the other workers usually walked home. She gave him a small wave, her face soft and welcoming in the evening light, as she stepped forward to greet him. They stood together in the cooling air, talking about small things like the changing weather and the upcoming autumn harvest. Nicholas felt a strange peace when he was near her, a feeling he had never experienced in all his years of wandering through different towns. Lily looked at his pale face and told him that she no longer felt invisible when he was around her. She said his presence made the weight of her scar feel lighter, as if the town's opinion did not matter anymore. Nicholas looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet emotion that he did not know how to express with words. He told her that her scar did not define who she was, and that she was the brightest person in this entire valley. The simple words made Lily's heart swell with happiness, and she realized that a strong bond was growing between them, one that had nothing to do with wealth or family status. They promised to meet again the next day before parting ways. Later that evening, a young boy brought a short note to Nicholas while he was cleaning the horse stalls in the main barn. The note was from old Maeve, asking him to meet her at the old abandoned watermill near the river at midnight. Nicholas knew the place well. It was dark, quiet, and surrounded by thick trees where no one ever walked after dark. He destroyed the note in his hands, throwing the pieces into the lantern fire, and waited for the night to deepen. When the clock struck midnight, Nicholas moved through the woods with incredible speed, his pale form slipping through the shadows like a ghost among the trees. He reached the old wooden mill and found Maeve sitting on a broken bench, a small lantern burning at her feet to light the damp room. She looked up when he entered through the broken doorway, her old eyes filled with a serious look that made him stop in his tracks. She pointed to the wooden box resting on the table. Maeve opened the box and spread the yellowed documents out under the dim light of the lantern, her hands steadying the papers against the wind. She told him to sit down and listen to her carefully, as the story she was about to tell would change everything he knew about himself. She began to speak of King Vincent, a powerful leader of the night who possessed white hair and pale skin just like Nicholas. Vincent had ruled the Northern Valley with justice for many years. Vincent had fallen in love with a human woman named Helena, and they had a son together who carried the blood of both worlds in his veins. To protect his family from greedy men in the town, Vincent had altered his legal will, leaving all his vast lands and wealth to his young son. But before the boy could grow up to claim his inheritance, Vincent died suddenly, and the child was stolen away into the dark night, his memory wiped by a cruel trick. Maeve reached out her shaking hand and touched the silver medallion that hung around Nicholas's neck, her eyes filling with tears. She told him that this piece of silver belonged to that lost child, the true king of the Northern Valley who had been denied his home. Nicholas listened to her words, his heart hammering against his chest as the pieces of his broken memory began to stir in his mind. He reached up and touched the crescent mark behind his left ear, his mind spinning. He asked Maeve who had done this to his family, his voice turning cold and sharp for the first time since she had known him. Maeve looked around the dark mill to ensure they were alone before she whispered the name of Thomas Kingston, the wealthiest man in the county. She explained that Kingston had forged the papers to steal the land and had paid men to hide the child where no one would ever find him. Maeve warned Nicholas that Kingston was a dangerous man who would do anything to keep his wealth and power from being taken away. She told him to keep the documents hidden in a safe place until they had enough proof to face him in front of the town judge. Nicholas nodded his head, his pale face set with a deep determination, as he placed the papers back into the wooden box and closed the lid firmly. Unknown to them, a man was standing outside the cracked window of the old mill, listening to their conversation in the dark night. He was one of Thomas Kingston's private guards, sent to follow the old woman after she was seen asking questions at the records office earlier that day. He slipped away into the trees, mounting his horse to ride back to his master's grand estate with the dangerous news that would change their plans. Early the next morning, Nicholas met Lily near the old stone bridge at the edge of the Evans property to share his discovery. The morning air was cool and foggy, hiding them from the sight of the main house where her father was sleeping. He told her everything Maeve had revealed to him the night before, showing her the old drawings and the silver medallion. Lily listened in complete silence, her hands covering her mouth in shock as the truth of his identity unfolded. Lily looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope for his future in the valley. She told him that if this story was true, he was not a simple drifter. He was the rightful owner of the entire Northern Valley. She warned him that Thomas Kingston would never give up his power without a fight, and that they needed to find the original deed to prove the claim in court. She offered to help him search. They realized that the original deed might still be locked inside the old iron safe in the town records warehouse, a stone building near the center of the valley. Nicholas planned to go there under the cover of night to look for the papers with Maeve's help before Kingston could find out. Lily promised to keep watch and gather any information she could from her father's conversations at dinner that evening to protect him. Meanwhile, inside his large mansion, Thomas Kingston walked back and forth across his thick carpet, his face twisted with rage. His guard had just told him about the meeting at the old watermill and the white-haired man who carried the silver medallion. Kingston knew that if the truth came out, he would lose his lands, his wealth, and his high position in society. He decided to act quickly to destroy the threat before it grew. Kingston ordered his men to go to the town records warehouse that very night and destroy every single paper from 20 years ago. He told them to leave no evidence behind, even if they had to burn the entire building to the ground to ensure his safety. He wanted to make sure that the lost heir would never be able to prove his identity to the judge or the townspeople. A heavy rain began to fall as midnight approached, turning the dirt roads into thick mud that made travel difficult. Lily was sitting by her bedroom when she saw a bright orange glow rising over the trees near the town center. Her heart dropped as she realized the records warehouse was on fire, the flames licking the dark night sky despite the heavy rain. She grabbed her coat and ran out into the storm. Nicholas arrived at the scene just as the wooden roof of the warehouse began to catch fire from the oil his men had spilled. Thick black smoke poured out of the windows, and a few townspeople stood back, unable to stop the heat of the blaze with their small water buckets. Nicholas knew that his entire past was inside that burning building, and he did not hesitate for a single second before action. Inside, the heat was intense, making his pale skin blister and his vision blur from the heavy smoke that filled the rooms. He navigated through the falling timber until he found the iron safe, its metal hot to the touch from the surrounding flames. Using his great strength, he smashed the iron lock with a heavy stone and pulled out the small metal box containing the original deeds before the roof collapsed. Nicholas burst through the front doors of the burning building, covered in soot and coughing from the smoke that filled his lungs. His arms had light burns from the heat, but he held the metal box tightly against his chest, like a treasure that could never be replaced. Lily ran through the crowd and caught him as he stumbled into the mud, tears mixing with the rain on her face. They looked at each other, knowing they had saved the truth. The news of the public hearing spread through the valley like wildfire within a single day, drawing crowds from every corner. Landowners, local merchants, and curious townspeople traveled for miles to fill the main room of the courthouse on a bright morning. Everyone wanted to see the final resolution of the case that involved a stolen kingdom, a missing child, and the most powerful man in the county. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the clock struck 10. Nicholas walked into the courtroom with a steady step, accompanied by Lily on his right and old Maeve on his left. The room became perfectly quiet as the crowd stared at his white hair and pale skin, noticing the quiet strength in his eyes that had not been there before. On the opposite side of the room sat Thomas Kingston, dressed in his finest suit and surrounded by expensive lawyers who looked confident. The town judge knocked his wooden mallet on the desk to call the room to order and began the session. Kingston's lawyers stood up first, arguing that Nicholas was nothing but a nameless drifter who was trying to steal property from respectable families who had earned it. They claimed that the documents were fakes and that the white-haired man was an impostor who did not belong in a civilized court of law. Maeve stood up next, her old voice clear and firm as she addressed the judge and the crowd of neighbors. She presented the old letters she had kept for 20 years and explained the history of King Vincent's family to the court. She pointed to the silver medallion around Nicholas's neck and told the court about the crescent mark behind his left ear, which matched the royal records exactly. Kingston laughed loudly from his seat, shouting that an old woman's bedtime stories were not legal proof in a court of law. He demanded that the judge dismiss the case immediately and throw the liars into jail for fraud against his name. The crowd began to murmur, and some of the townspeople looked uncertain, wondering if Kingston was right about the lack of hard evidence to prove the claim. Nicholas stepped forward to the front desk and opened the iron box he had saved from the burning warehouse during the storm. He pulled out the original deed of the Northern Valley, signed by King Vincent himself with a royal wax seal that could not be forged by anyone. He handed the paper to the judge, his pale face calm and his eyes fixed on Kingston, who suddenly stopped laughing. The judge put on his spectacles and examined the old deed with great care, comparing the signature and the wax seal with official town records. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper turning felt loud against the wooden walls. Kingston's face began to lose its color as he watched the judge's expression turn from doubt to serious belief in the validity of the papers. Before the judge could speak, Arthur Evans rose from his seat in the front row of the crowd, surprising everyone. He looked at Nicholas for a long moment before he addressed the courtroom, his voice booming through the hall. He stated that he had judged this white-haired man harshly because of his position, but now he recognized that Nicholas possessed more honor and courage than anyone else in the room. The judge struck his mallet down once more, silencing the murmuring crowd before he delivered his final verdict to the town. He announced that after a full examination of the original deed and the physical marks, the court recognized Nicholas as the true son of King Vincent and the sole legal owner of the Northern Valley lands. A loud cheer broke out from the back rows as Kingston sank into his chair. The official decision altered the valley completely over the following weeks. bringing a new sense of peace to the land. Thomas Kingston lost his influence and his wealth, as his old allies turned their backs on him to avoid the shame of his crimes. He was left entirely alone in his large house, a broken man who had to face the reality of his own greed. His empty rooms became his only company. Nicholas took possession of his rightful inheritance, but he did not use his new power to seek revenge against those who had wronged him. Instead, his first act as the leader of the valley was to rewrite the work contracts for all the laborers on his estates. He raised their wages, gave them fair hours, and ensured that every family had a safe home and enough food for the winter months. He visited Maeve at her small cabin and brought her to a beautiful cottage near the river, ensuring she would never have to worry about wood or food again. He thanked her for keeping the secrets safe for over 20 years, holding her wrinkled hands with his pale fingers. Maeve wept with joy, knowing that the family she loved had finally returned to their rightful place in the valley. Arthur Evans also changed his ways, spending more time with his daughter and treating her with the respect she deserved since the trial. He invited Nicholas to the main house for dinner, where they sat together as equals and discussed the future of the valley. The old barriers between them vanished, replaced by a mutual understanding that brought peace to the entire household and town. A few months later, a grand ball was held once again at the Evans estate to celebrate the arrival of the autumn harvest. The main hall was filled with the same bright lamps and lively music, but the crowd was entirely different this time. Local farmers, workers, and townspeople danced alongside the wealthy landowners, their laughter filling the room with a genuine warmth that had been missing before. Nicholas walked into the ballroom, wearing a fine dark suit that contrasted sharply with his pure white hair and pale skin. He no longer hid in the shadows, and the guests greeted him with respectful nods as he moved through the crowd. He walked straight toward the large glass window, where Lily was standing, looking beautiful in a green silk dress that matched her eyes perfectly. He stopped in front of her and offered his cold, steady hand, a soft smile appearing on his face as he looked at her. He did not say a word about her scar, and Lily felt no need to hide it from the people around them. He asked her if she would dance with him once more, his voice calm and clear over the sound of the violins. Lily placed her hand in his and smiled, her eyes bright with tears of happiness, as they stepped onto the polished floor together. The crowd moved back to give them room, watching them with admiration as they moved gracefully through the steps of the dance. They were no longer two lonely outsiders hiding from the world. They were together, leading their people into a bright new era. As the music carried them across the floor, Lily looked past Nicholas's shoulder toward the wide windows that opened up to the dark mountains of the northern valley. She thought about the long road they had traveled over the past year, from the quiet pain of isolation to the shared strength they had found in each other's presence. The deep scar on her cheek no longer felt like a mark of shame or a reminder of what she had lost. It was simply a part of her story, a line that led her to this exact moment of peace. She saw the future stretching out before them, like a calm river flowing through the valley, filled with days where people would be judged by the kindness of their actions, rather than the perfection of their faces or the status of their names. Nicholas held her hand firmly, his pale skin cool against her palm, and she knew that the long-hidden shadows of his kingdom would no longer bring fear but protection to everyone who lived beneath them. They had built something real out of their shared brokenness, a bond that would endure through the changing seasons and the passing years without losing its quiet strength. She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the steady rhythm of the dance and the warmth of the room, completely content with the knowledge that they had finally found where they belonged, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring with an open heart and a deep belief that love and dignity would always find a way to heal the world.